Well, I don't know if you're somebody that follows the news, but this week we've seen a new strain of coronavirus emerge, and I know everybody's heart sinks. And it brings consternation because we think, well, are the vaccines going to cover us against this? Is this going to be even more effective than the last one? What does this mean? But just imagine if Ebola virus had been discovered in Britain. Now that really would have caused alarm. I don't know if you've heard of Ebola virus, but it's highly contagious. And the symptoms, although initially are quite similar to coronavirus, Ebola virus has something a lot worse. It attacks the internal gastrointestinal tract. It causes bruising and internal bleeding and leads to a very unpleasant death. And what's most disconcerting about Ebola virus is that all this is going on inside and there's nothing visible on the outside. It's a dreadful disease. Now, the last time we were together, we considered external attacks that were coming on this work of rebuilding the wall. They were external threats that came from outside. They were the enemy without. Now, those attacks were largely unsuccessful. And therefore, the enemy changes tack. And what we see in this passage, and in several other passages within the book of Nehemiah, is a change to an internal threat. Something going on inside. The enemy within. Now, this is an often repeated strategy. If you cast your mind back over the book of Acts, you will know that initially there was an external threat to the early church. Peter and John are brought in and told, you must not speak again in the name of Jesus. Then the next chapter, chapter 5, we see an internal threat. We see Ananias and Sapphira trying to deceive the apostles. That's followed by another internal threat in chapter 6. The dissension and division about the unfair distribution of money in the support of widows within the church. Our enemy, if he cannot succeed with one approach, he will try another. And if that approach doesn't work, he'll try another. Or he might try combining different approaches so that they both come at once. We have to be aware that as the people of God, we will always be under threat. There will always be approaches that are trying to destroy us and to bring us down. Paul, from his own experience, puts it like this. When we were coming to Macedonia, our flesh had no rest, but we were troubled on every side. Without were fightings, within were fears. There was something going on outside, and there was something going on inside. External and internal. But whichever it was, the aim was the same: to destroy the work of the Lord. What I want us to do this morning then is to consider these internal threats to the work of rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem and to learn lessons from them for ourselves and for our own congregation here. First thing we need to see is that this was a developing problem. As you read through Nehemiah, you get to chapter 5 and it kind of bursts on you from nowhere and you think, well, hold on a minute, where did that come from? chapter 5, verse 1, and there was a great cry of the people and their wives against their brethren the Jews. Oh, it just seems to come like a bolt out of the blue. But actually, that's not true. There were glimpses in earlier chapters that all was not quite right. There were things going on there that tell us that something wasn't quite right. So if you turn back to chapter 3 and verse 5, and remember chapter 3 is telling us about all the different people that built their little bit of the wall. Verse 5 tells us this: next unto them the Tekoites repaired, but their nobles put not their necks to the work of their Lord. There's a little bunch there who are not putting their back into it. They're not really taking it seriously. They're not really putting the effort in that the people are around them. Now, of course, that automatically breeds a problem, because people are going, well, they're not working very hard. Why should I? They're not putting any effort in. Why should I? Because I'll only have to do what they're not doing. You can see how this little thing is beginning. And in chapter 4, verse 10, we read these words. Judah said, so this is again one subdivision of the people, Judah said, the strength of the bearers of burdens is decayed, and there is much rubbish, so that we are not able to build the wall. They said, you know what? This is beyond us. There's so much rubble lying around here. We've got to clear all that rubble before we can actually start building anything. We're exhausted. We can't carry on like this. No. The work's got to stop. We just can't keep going. And then in verse 12 of chapter 4, we read this: and it came to pass that when the Jews which dwelt by them, so these are Jews that are living outside Jerusalem, but they're living near to their enemies, when the Jews which dwelt by them came, they said unto us 10 times, from all places whence you return unto us, they will be upon you. So, those people that we're living near, they're going to attack you. 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 They're going to attack. And every day they're saying the same thing 10 times. They're going to attack you. They're going to. Oh, that's deeply demoralizing, isn't it? How disconcerting is that? But what it reveals is that within the Jewish people, within the people of God, there are these strains, there are these things going on underneath the surface. They're largely hidden. You can just catch glimpses of them. But when we get to chapter 5, verse 1, bam! They burst onto the surface. Now they come into full view. Now it comes into focus. What was simmering away underneath now bursts out onto the surface. Now what's the problem? The problem, as it's seen in chapter 5, is that the people who are doing the work, the labourers, together with their wives, they make a complaint. And the complaint was that they now found themselves in great difficulty. And the difficulty that they had was that they didn't have the wherewithal to feed themselves. And clearly, if you can't feed yourself, you ain't going to be doing any of the work. How did they get into this position? What was it that had caused this crisis? Well, firstly, because they were focusing on the wall, they weren't focusing on tilling their land and harvesting their crops. They were focusing on the work of the Lord. But then, together with that, there was an increase in the tax demands that their overrulers were placing on them. And so in order to kind of meet the disparity between their income and their outgoings, they said, well, we've got to raise some cash somehow. They mortgaged their property. They mortgaged their house, their vineyards, their olive groves. They mortgaged what they had in order to raise money, to keep food on the table and to pay the taxman. But eventually, even that money ran out. So what do we do now? Well, they say, verse 5, now our flesh is as the flesh of our brethren, our children as their children. Lo, we bring into bondage our sons and our daughters to be servants. We're even selling our children into slavery in order to make money to put food on the table. And Nehemiah, he comes to the place where he describes this thing in verse 18. He describes it as a heavy bondage. A heavy bondage. And what was worse was that the people to whom they owed money were charging interest. They were adding even more to this financial burden that was upon them. And these poor people who were doing the work, they had no hope of liberating themselves. And of course, the problem was compounded by the fact that they were focusing on the work and also by the fact that it seems that they had quite large families. And they were catapulted into this crisis. And as they speak, you can hear the despair in their voices. They are absolutely desperate. While the loan sharks, the nobles and rulers, are getting richer and richer and richer. These unscrupulous people are exploiting the crisis in their own brethren, in their own people, to their own advantage. Now this doesn't look good, does it? But there are some lessons here we need to learn. Before we move on, we need to learn a few lessons. First lesson is this: that internal dissension in the church usually has a small beginning. It starts small. Sometimes it starts with murmuring, just not quite happy with something, so we kind of murmur about it to one another. Don't discuss it openly. We never deal with things when they're still small, but we should. The same happened to Moses, you remember. It's recorded in these words in Psalm 106, verse 25. But they murmured in their tents and hearkened not unto the voice of the Lord. They went home moaning, complaining, murmuring. And you know what the end of that was, don't you? 40 years in the wilderness. Paul, in his letter to the church in Philippi, says, do all things without murmurings and disputings. Beware of small beginnings. Second thing, small beginnings lead to bigger things. Murmuring leads to careless talk. And what we find in chapter 4, verses 10 and 12, is that the people of God actually start discussing their grievances with the people outside. They start sharing with the people outside the problems that they're experiencing within the work of the Lord. Now, this is particularly damaging. When the internal matters of the church are discussed outside, well, those small beginnings are no longer small beginnings. Those are really being reinforced and becoming bigger. Beware of allowing small beginnings to grow. Thirdly, beware of confusing self-interest with the work of God. Now, I guess if you'd spoken to these nobles and rulers who were doing all right for themselves and said, well, what is it you think you're doing? What's your strategy? What are you doing? They'd have said, well, we're just entrepreneurs. We've identified a niche in the market. They'd have put a good positive spin on it, I'm sure. They'd have said, look, we can see that these folk, they've got a need. They need to raise some money. So we're quite happy to lend them money against their property or against their children. We're quite happy to meet the need. I'm sure they would have put it like that. And what that meant was they were confusing self-gain with the work of God. And they were putting themselves ahead of their brethren and bringing their brethren into complete and utter penury. No, the need of the hour was not for them to make money. The need of the hour was generosity of spirit. That was what was needed at this moment, not mean, tight-fisted attitude. Now, it's important, I think, the way chapter 5 is constructed, because it contrasts the behaviour of these nobles and rulers with the behaviour of Nehemiah himself. Did you catch that at the end of the chapter? It records what Nehemiah did in the 12 years that he was the governor. Now remember, so that meant he was the most important person in Jerusalem, appointed by Artaxerxes. What does he do? Well, you read what they prepared in his kitchen every day. That was some preparation, wasn't it? What did he say? He has 1 ox, 6 sheep, fowls, all sorts of wine. He has all of this prepared in his kitchen every day, because he's feeding 150 people plus visitors. Now, how does he do that? Well, he tells us that unlike his predecessors, he didn't take from the people the taxes that he was entitled to take from them. Instead, he paid for it out of his own pocket. That is what was required at this moment. Generosity of spirit. And Nehemiah was generous. We need to beware, and we can all be guilty of this, of confusing our own personal needs, our own personal interests with the interests of the people of God. We can think to ourselves, what's good for us is good for them. That might not necessarily be true. Sometimes we have to be willing to forego what is in our interests in order to promote the interests of the people of God, like Nehemiah did. So that's the first thing. This was a developing problem. It began small and grew big. Next thing, it was a diverse problem. Now, to this point, we've really focused around chapter 5 and what it is that's happening here. But actually, this internal conflict arises several times throughout the book of Nehemiah. It's seen in several forms. It takes different guises. And it didn't end with chapter 5. When you turn over into chapter 6, you find another form of internal attack on Nehemiah and the work. And it's extremely subtle. It's in verse 10. Afterward I came to the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, the son of Mehetabeel, who was shut up. And he said, let us meet together in the house of God within the temple, and let us shut the doors of the temple, for they will come to slay thee. Yea, in the night they will come to slay thee. Who is this man? Well, if you go to chapter 13, you discover that he's a priest. So this priest is saying, Nehemiah, come on, we've got to get into the temple, and we need to lock the door behind us, and we need to hide there because they're going to come and get you in the night. But interestingly, note the way Nehemiah describes what he's doing in verse 12. Lo, I perceived that God had not sent him, but that he had pronounced this prophecy against me. A prophecy. This man had spoken these words to Nehemiah in the name of the Lord. He's saying, the Lord sent me. The Lord gave me these words. Come on, Nehemiah, we've got to hide. Now, of course, this is very powerful. And it's especially powerful in the mind of the genuine believer. These words appear to have come with all the authority of a priest and with all the authority of the Lord. Who's going to disobey a priest? Who's going to disobey the Lord? It's all very subtle. It's all very disconcerting. It's all very discouraging. But Nehemiah sees through it. Nehemiah perceives someone else is behind this. Someone else is paying him to do this. He's been hired by Tobiah and Sanballat, those two old enemies from outside. Like Balaam of old, Shemaiah was willing to speak the words of the Lord, so-called, for money. But he's not the only one. If you see verse 14 of the same chapter, Nehemiah is praying, my God, think thou upon Tobiah and Sanballat according to these their works, and on the prophetess Noadiah, and the rest of the prophets that would have put me in fear. It wasn't just Shemaiah. No. There's a prophetess who's speaking in the name of the Lord. And not just her, but a whole bunch of prophets who are all speaking in the name of the Lord. And their sole purpose was to put him in fear. But it doesn't end there. You turn over to chapter 13 and you discover that there's one of the priests, Eliashib, who, when the temple is being built, he sections off a bit of it, a room of it. Who for? For Tobiah. He's made a room in the temple for him outside, because he's got an alliance with him. He's one of his oppos. Now, there's many lessons we can learn from this. The first of them is this, and this is quite uncomfortable. Opposition can often come from the most unexpected people. You would think that the nobles would be absolutely over the moon at the idea of rebuilding the city and of establishing good order and a place of beauty and where everything was functioning. You would think that would be in their interests. You would think that the priests would be delighted at the idea that the temple would be rebuilt and that the worship of Jehovah would be resumed, and that the people of God would be taught the things of the Lord. You would have thought that the prophets would have been delighted to have taught the people and to have seen the people spiritually minded and walking with God. But no. These three groups of people are all opposing the work. These three groups of people are all undermining the work. These three groups of people are all trying to get the work to stop. Sometimes opposition to the work of the Lord comes from the least expected place. It's the least expected who are most opposed. And was that not true in Jesus' day? Who were the most opposed to Jesus and his telling us of the Father in heaven? Well, it was the most religious. But actually, it wasn't just them. At times, it was those who were closest to Jesus. From that time forth began Jesus to show unto his disciples that he must go into Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and raised again the third day. Then Peter took him and began to rebuke him, saying, Be it far from thee, Lord, this shall not be unto thee. Peter, the principal disciple. Peter, one of the inner three. And there are moments when even the most spiritually minded oppose the work of God. Now that's difficult. Secondly, beware of doing the devil's work for him. Jesus' response to Peter is very uncomfortable. He turned and said unto Peter, Get thee behind me, Satan. Thou art an offence unto me, for thou savourest not the things that be of God, but those that be of men. Peter, you're thinking like the devil. Peter, you've only got the interests of men at heart. You're not thinking God's thoughts. And sometimes we can find ourselves doing the devil's work for him. And we can all be guilty of it. Many a church has closed its doors for the last time because the members were doing the devil's work. Brothers and sisters, beware. Beware of pouring cold water on every expression of enthusiasm. Beware of finding fault with every new idea. Beware of always finding a reason why some new initiative won't work and can't be undertaken. Sometimes we need to check ourselves. We need to bring ourselves up short. And before we respond, think, is my response in my interests? Or really is this in the interests of the church? I know these are difficult things, but these are things we need to think about. This was a diverse problem. It came from very many different angles and had different faces. But there are some important lessons. Finally, this was a devastating problem. While the nobles were making money, the labourers were getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And the lack of food was bringing them into great anxiety and was distracting them from the work of God. It was sowing seeds of resentment and division. And division is always deeply destructive to the work of the Lord. Now you'd think when you read Nehemiah that somehow he's kind of unflappable. He just seems unstoppable, unflinching, moving forwards. But in chapter 6, you even get a sense that this is beginning to get to him. He's recording what happens and how they're trying to weaken their hands and put them in fear in verses 9 and 14. And you know, maybe he's teetering on the brink. Do you know, he could easily have thrown in the towel. He could easily have returned to Shushan the palace. It would have been a far easier life for him. The stability of the palace and his work in the palace as the king's cupbearer was so much easier than this. The respect that he had there for this prominent role in the palace and the creature comforts that he enjoyed working in the palace. But if he'd thrown in the towel, not only would the work have ceased, but no doubt those enemies from outside would have been straight on it, pulling it all down. There's many lessons we can learn here from Nehemiah and his resolve to continue, but also from the danger that these threats pose to us in the church. Firstly, disunity will always destroy the work of God. You know, unity is a prerequisite for the blessing of God. We read it in our opening psalm. Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. And the psalmist is saying, well, look at that. Look at those brothers. They're working together. They're living together in unity. That's a rare thing. Take a good look. And then what does he say? He says, there, where brethren are dwelling together in unity, there the Lord commanded the blessing, even life forevermore. God is looking for a united people. And where he sees a united people, there he dispenses the blessing of eternal life. The early church were aware of that. So when the crisis arises about how the money was distributed between the Hellenistic and the Hebrew widows within the congregation, what do? We've got to address that. Address it straight away. And they snuff out that division by putting deacons to address the problem and to do the work. Now, you've all heard of George Whitefield, I hope. And when George Whitefield first came to Wales, he records his experience in his journal. He puts it like this: Blessed be God. There seems to be a noble spirit gone out into Wales. And I believe ere long there will be more visible fruits of it. What inclines me strongly to think so is that the partition wall of bigotry and party zeal is broken down, and ministers and teachers of different communions join with one heart and one mind to carry on the kingdom of Jesus Christ. The Lord make all the Christian world thus minded. For, till this is done, I fear, we must despair of any great reformation in the Church of God. So, look, I've been there. I've been to Wales. I've seen Baptist ministers, Anglican ministers, Presbyterian ministers. I've seen them working together in the cause of the gospel. And I suspect God is going to bless them. And boy, was he right. God did bless them. Listen, unity among us is worth striving for. And if we've got it, it's worth striving to keep it. Isn't that what Paul said in Ephesians? Endeavouring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. It requires endeavour. It's not just going to happen on its own. We have to keep working at it. And that includes foregoing our own interests at times. Lastly, be careful to walk with God. Be careful to walk with God. Nehemiah, with these various threats that kind of comes on him, you think, well, he seems to respond so swiftly and so decisively. How does he do that? How is it that he is able to work in that way, for example, with these oppressive money-making rulers? How does he resist the temptation to kind of simply turn a blind eye to them and just press on with the work? Well, we need to read what he says. Chapter 5, verse 19. Think upon me, my God, for good. How does Nehemiah withstand the contrary activities of those who are threatening him? How does he keep going and resist it? Chapter 6, verse 12. And lo, I perceived that God had not sent him. How does he continue to resist? Chapter 6, verse 14. My God, think thou upon Tobiah and Sanballat. What is going on here? Nehemiah is revealing that he is in close communication with God. He's walking with God. And so when these trials come to him, his first reaction is to speak to God, to talk to God, to share it with God, to communicate with God. And his relationship with God is the thing that he coveted above everything else. He wanted the favour of God. And so he kept going. He is in fear of sinning against God. He even says so in chapter 6, verse 13. Therefore was he hired that I should be afraid and do so and sin. He's afraid of sinning because he's afraid of losing the favour of God. And it's that desire for God that gives this edge to him and this edge to his perception that he sees through the things that are brought to him, even though they're brought to him in the name of God. He sees through it, it's false. Tell me, is this what motivates you? Is this the big thing about your life? Your communication with God. Is this what motivates you? Keeping that communication with God. Is this what motivates you as a church? Keeping your communication lines open with God. Let me ask you, are you experiencing, as the people of God here, are you experiencing his favour? Do you want his favour? Maybe you say, well, when we look back, there was a time when I think we knew his favour. But not so sure now. Maybe there are some things to put right then. in order to recover the favour of God. Maybe you say, well, do you know what? In our little meetings, we do enjoy the presence of God. If that's so, endeavour to keep the unity of the Spirit and do everything in your power to avoid losing the favour of God. Because it is that will bring down the smile from heaven and will bring blessing to you as a people. Well, here we are, some lessons. They're a bit all over the place, but hopefully something that will benefit your soul and give you something to think about. May God bring these things to our hearts. Amen.